Seham. She is a professor
Thank
at
you.
Gustavus Adolphus College and author of Improv Is It Anyway.
And yes, and soda spritzer.
And soda spritzer. So let's give her.
Well, way back at a early Funny Woman Festival, I was thrilled to have my book just come out and have signing that was organized. Were you involved in that, Jill? I think you did the one in Minneapolis.
I was at the original Funny Woman Festival in Chicago. Yes, I was not one of the organizers.
And so I had a signing of this. I'm just gonna do shameless promotion of Whose Improv Is It Anyway, which is a book that came out of my dissertation and my own personal experience of really struggling with what I thought was a real imbalance of power, particularly in terms of gender in improv. And I had a long history with that. A theater company with an improv troupe where I personally struggled and wanted to figure out what that was all about. And so I ended up really doing an intensive study of it. And then I ended up managing to get it published in time for tenure at Gustavus Adolphus College. So that was timing. And then continue to think about it and do presentations at academic conferences, the Association for Theater in Higher Education, the Pedagogy and Theater of the Oppressed conferences and so forth. And I ended up doing one more chapter in this book, which kind of outlines specific exercises that people could do to address these issues of power imbalance and so on. Then I began to hear, and actually see that women were doing much better than I had done, and hearing from a number of people that really this issue of sexism in improv was kind of the past. I mean, I have a lot of students who say, "Oh, I'm not a feminist," and I say, "And what's your major?" "Oh, pre-med." But in any event, that I wondered whether there was any point going on with another book about the subject. And in doing additional research, I stumbled upon Jill Eickmann's blog. And actually what I forgot to do was introduce the panelists, but I will in a second. She has a blog called Femprovisor, in which there was kind of a very exciting and controversial discussion about the very questions of equality or power dynamic between the genders in improv. So that kind of kicked me off with the notion of, yes, it's worth continuing this discussion, this exploration toward another book, but let's get some feedback and let's have a panel discussion with some experts and get the input of some improvisers in an audience and so forth. So that was what brought me here. But we have on our panel Hannah Kuhlmann, who is an improviser and a sex educator at the Smitten Kitten. She improvises at the Smitten Kitten, but she also improvises everywhere in town. We have Jill Bernard, the co-founder of Huge and the education director and improviser about town. We have Hannah Wydeven, who is a youth educator at Huge, and she does a lot of improv work with teens, which I think is a particular source of concern. And Jill Eickmann, as I mentioned before, is the author of the blog Improviser, and she's the artistic director of Leela Improv Troupe in San Francisco. Am I correct? Yes. So this is an illustrious panel, in my view. So I was going to say, I'd like to just ask each person to speak briefly about just this basic topic. I'm being very vague about the specifics, but maybe Jill, if you would begin, Jill Eickmann, with what you were thinking when you started Femprovisor, and then what the controversy emerged to be, I think would be informative. That'd be cool.
Sure. Yeah, so Femprovisor is my blog. main impetus in doing this was to have a more active women's presence in the blogosphere and improv. Also, having a theater company in San Francisco, improvised theater company called Lila, has a very feminine name. I'm very much about creating a more active female presence in the improv community in general, not just online, but nationally and internationally. I also come from personal experience like the rest of us have, and have, experienced a lot of discrepancy, I would say. I guess one of my most poignant experiences was with Upright Citizens Brigade, where I received my first formal training outside of college in New York, and I was the only woman of 16 people in my level 1 class, and this was in 2001. So that coming into the industry that way, it was kind of a wake-up call for me. And then also in college, it was a pretty balanced thing in college, but I did notice that there were many instances where there were power dynamics in college as well. I directed an improv group for a number of years, and I still remember the incident where we had a very mixed gender cast, 4 men, 4 women, and all the men created an improv group on their own, missing a very important rehearsal before a show to book a show for themselves, just those 4 men. So, I mean, I love all these men, they're good friends of mine, they're people I learned from, they're my family, my improv family, but I mean, these things should just not go unnoticed. I really feel like women often feel, I know myself included in that, I'm not gonna say all women feel this way, that they should just, shut up about it, not talk about it, not make a stink about it. But I do think it's important for us to voice when things are bothering us, when things don't feel fair, when things don't feel equal, when there is a power shift in the room. I think it's important for us to speak up about it. So that's where I'm coming from with Femprovisor.
And Jill, you did a specific blog where you said, improv troops, do you really want to have women participate in your company? Here are some ways that you could attract and or support women who would potentially join your company and not have them.
And I'm asking people to go beyond just a numbers game, but to really think about, women have they may have a certain presence to them that is different than a man's. I'm not saying all women are like that, but they may, and to include that type of playing in their troupe, to not just see them as a number in the group. Oh, great, we got the 1 woman in our cast, we're good, check. But to really work with that woman's presence and that woman's sensibility.
Right, that she would be convenient to play whatever female character you needed, but that it wasn't really about her perspective at all. Well, you hit there was a firestorm, to put it in a polite way. And then I read your response.
Yeah.
To
a different thread, actually.
To a different thread. And we don't have to only talk about this particular blog, but I thought it was just very catalyzing for me. You want to talk about your response and then anything else you want to talk about?
Okay, sure. I think the blog that you're referring to, the one that the entry that I responded to on Jill's blog was one about the word femprovisor, which I thought was super interesting, and I don't want to Jill Eickmann, hi.
I keep looking at the screen.
I know, but really you're tiny.
It's really tempting.
Hello.
It just look like 4 beams of light to me. So.
Good. Perfect. That's how we actually look, so that's perfect. The particular entry on Jill's blog, which is really cool, you should check it out, that I think I responded to was about the word femprovisor, and it was sort of a call to arms of like, hey, instead of always referring to improvisers as improvisers, like, do you identify as a femprovisor? Here's what that means. And if I recall, I haven't read it in a while, but if I recall correctly, I think it was about feminist ideology and improv philosophies, and identifying as an improviser and a feminist at the same time. And did I do that justice, Jill?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, good. My response to that was that as awesome as that goal is, I personally didn't feel empowered by identifying as a femprovisor, although other people totally should, because because of how I identify personally, not just as an improviser, but in terms of my sexuality and my gender. So
Sure.
can I segue
Sure,
now into
absolutely.
my point of view on this
Yes,
stuff?
please.
Perfect. So I'm queer identified, and that's a sexual orientation as well as a gender identity. So for me, I've struggled throughout my life trying to figure out how classical femininity relates to me, and it's kind of a rocky relationship sometimes. So in my experience as an improviser and in various little sub-communities in the Minneapolis improv scene, which is awesome and very progressive in my opinion, I have at times felt really uncomfortably at odds with people who I think are doing really empowering feminist work. I identify as a feminist, but I often use gender-neutral pronouns in some parts of my life. Other times, she and her are totally fine. I don't care. I have huge boobs. So a lot of times it's easier for people. I have a lot of very prominent secondary sex characteristics that are really feminine. So, and it doesn't really bother me to be called she or her. But sometimes people call me they, and I'm super into it. I identify as pretty butch. So in the improv world, a lot of times I find it kind of disempowering and alienating to be in an environment that's all about lady prov and feminine improv that is for ladies and vaginas, because in my personal life I don't identify with. I've actually struggled with my relationship to that. So so I'm super pumped about this panel because I personally feel really conflicted, because on the one hand, some of my favorite improv groups are all female improv groups of the Minneapolis. But on the other hand, and Wydeven and I have talked about this, I'm like, God, what, can you guys not market yourselves as the girliest woman lady prov team ever? Because I'm so sick of being othered in situations where I don't want to be othered. I would be far more comfortable if the norm for improv was incredible diversity all the time, rather than regular improv and the improv that the girls do. So, but I know that there are all these different reasons why people want to secure safe spaces for themselves that are female focused or woman focused, or in this case, focused on empowering female identified improvisers, which I think is really cool language. So, so that's my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to come to you because there's a good segue here in terms of your troupe. But I do, my first reaction to regular improv versus girly improv,
Right.
to some extent, is to say, you know, we've had people say, well, why is there a Black History Month? You
I know.
Why isn't there a White History Month? And you say, well, because every other month is White History Month.
Right, exactly.
So, in a way, to say there isn't a space for women's improv is to miss that regular improv is men's improv. In
So
my
the privilege,
Yeah,
the
it could
privilege
be.
piece that you're talking about,
Right.
the privilege piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go to Hannah.
So I guess my perspective is a little bit different because my age is different. So I have a different experience. I was a child of the 90s. I wasn't improvising in the 90s, which means that there's a little bit of a difference in the way that the younger generation of women that are in this room maybe were taught about their own womanhood. And I think a lot of that has to do with the idea that we were kind of told that, like, the problems are solved now. You're good. You can just do what you want to do. You can go off and be a pre-med student. Everyone else has paved the way for you. It's fine. So when we get into a situation like at Huge, where things do seem really great and are really progressive, what I notice more is a lot of internalized sexism and difficulty actually having the real conversation, because there is this like accepted fact that somehow everything's cool. We're all good. We don't need to talk about it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the problem for me that I see as my biggest mission to address, is how can we have conversations that are actually meaningful and addressing the problems that are there, including every other type of sub-community or marginalized community that's in that's at Huge or any other improv community. How can we address all of that at once and say that they're equally important to talk about? Something I've noticed a lot when working with teenagers is that there's not as much weird sexuality issues there, because it's not, I ban it right away. Like, we're not going to do anything about sex in this space, and so it doesn't need to happen here. But there are a lot of differences between the way that maybe a 14-year-old girl and a 14-year-old boy will approach their first improv class or opportunity with me or another coach. And what I noticed is that there is a definite restraint in terms of how these young women are coming at this new art form. And there's not as much restraint from the boys that are coming at that art form. And that tells me a lot about how we're raised to be able to speak out loud, to say how we feel about things. And I think that's the most interesting thing for me in terms of what I want to tackle here is how can we actually legitimately address those issues without being called bitches, basically. How can we raise issues that are still there without being criticized for being like uppity bitches?
or anti-improv somehow. You know,
right.
I don't want to have all these rules about being, you know, egalitarian. That's a counter to the freedom of improv. I mean, that's been an argument that I've encountered a lot.
Yeah, and when
you're censoring me.
Yes. Oh my God.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Speaking your truth, you're censoring me.
Right.
And when I started the Minneapolis, Huge wasn't around yet, and Brave New Workshop was basically the only game in town, besides comedy sports, obviously. But for long form stuff, I was taking classes at Brave New Workshop, and I was doing Six Ring Circus. And I don't know how many people had experience in that, but it was, I think, more similar to what you were talking about, Jill, with your experience. There was a lot of bad behavior on stage, and most of the groups were 6 men and 2 women. And that was the case for the group that I was in. I felt like there was a lot of sexual violence on stage, a lot of violence against women. So my reaction was to find 3 other women in the community who I wanted to improvise with and improvise with them. When I originally started the group, it was not a statement. It was more safety. My personal safety, my personal desire to make good improv without being turned into boobs, basically, TNA. So, but the reaction to that was really interesting and enlightening, and that's kind of what set me off on the path of like, something's wrong here. Because a lot of my male friends were like, I just don't get why you have to do an all-lady thing. Like, why is that even an issue? Just because I asked 3 women to do improv with me, we weren't even trying to make a statement, but now we are. Like, now we definitely will. So that was an enlightening thing for me.
Cool. One of the most powerful improvisers I've ever met is Jill Bernard. You don't ever seem to be intimidated in this context, but I would love to have you, you know, let folks know where you're coming from too.
Funny thing happened 12 hours ago. I was doing a show last night called Improv Poker Party, and so the audience gets to vote who they thought was funniest, and you bet on how if you think you're gonna win, like it's a poker party.
Oh, okay.
And the way the show ended up is that there was a cast of 6, 3 men, 3 women, and the 3 women were the bottom 3 by audience vote. And some of that was how we bet. Some of that is because I'm over 40 and shouldn't be asked to do a show that late at night. And some of it because it was at Comedy Sports, which is a different audience than here at Huge. A late night show at Comedy Sports feels a lot more like a college kind of a boy vibe, you know, a little bit of a frat vibe. Maybe it's still uptown, it's still hipster, but there's a little bit more Abercrombie and Fitch. And it was funny to me thinking, guess what I'm going to talk about tomorrow morning, everybody. Good night. I mean, I've often been the only woman on stage and the only female presence, and I've done what I could to make inroads for other women. I've done what I could to create opportunities for other women, and unapologetically always found time to be just with other women, because I think something amazing happens when we're left alone. But of course I was watching the show last night with a different kind of eye, thinking of this discussion in the morning, and I noticed what you wrote about in your book, that a lot of the moves, a lot of the things we were doing, the 3 women, were these beautiful sacrificial moves that made the show so much better that no one in the audience is going to be like, oh, what exquisite support. Did you see how she made that third person entrance? What a giving move. Like, no one was going to vote that. Like, oh, her subtle character choice allowed him to shine. Like, no one's going to make that choice. But if you're on a team of improvisers, you need people like that. And very often people think they have a gender binary and they don't. I worked with an improv team where they thought they had a male-female problem because they had some of each. And I worked with them and I realized they didn't have a male-female dynamic. They had a steamroller, wilting violet dynamic, and it didn't matter what your gender was. There were people in both categories of both genders. So often, that's my main concern is very often there's different columns. Some of the things that happen to female improvisers also happen to bad improvisers. Some of the things that male improvisers do, bad improvisers also do. So I want to know if your behavior is because you're a male improviser or because you're a bad improviser. And I want to know if you're feeling oppressed because you're a female improviser or because you're a bad improviser. Sometimes you'll watch improvisers who say, the men on my team never let me get a word out. And you watch them play and there's opportunity after opportunity for them to say a word, and they don't. So I absolutely want to make sure that women are improvising at the top of their ability before they pull out the card of I'm being oppressed as a woman. And I absolutely want to make sure that men are improvising at the best of their ability before someone says it's because they're a man. It might be just because you're not good at improv and you don't know how to listen. It's not because you have a penis, it's because you're not good at improv. And we can talk to you about that and make you a better improviser.
I agree, and I think that it's just bad improv or they're just bad improvisers is also a get out of jail free card that some people use when, the 6 men are steamrolling the one woman on the team. So I agree with you. I might be coming at it from the other direction.
Yeah. And I have a very luxurious situation that I get to improvise only with good improvisers.
And you've created that situation,
Yeah,
which has made opportunities for a lot of people. So that's amazing.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think it's tricky because I'm a teacher and I often teach beginning level students, so I'm very protective, and I'm concerned about the words good and bad, because when I'm teaching level 1 improvisers, I don't use those words. I use choice, I use commitment, so I think that's also a concern of mine to use those words good and bad, and to bring in what is happening in the room when there's all men but one woman in an improv class and all the scenes are about prostitutes and mail order brides and women are being used as sexual objects. There's that dynamic too. So, and we often see that in beginning level improv classes. So, I'd love to hear from Hannah, I guess this is Hannah who teaches teenagers, how she deals with that.
Yeah. Well, I think that, this topic is tricky. And I think that's why, Jill, for your blog, there was so much fiery backlash. And I don't know how many people in this room read that specific post about, basically it was called the 10 ways to keep female improvisers.
Cast and keep.
Yeah, cast and keep female improvisers, and there's a lot of contextual things to it. Your experience as a teacher, your experience in your theater, your experience in your city. But then I think that the piece that got people to feel very fiery about it is the same thing that got me sort of feeling fiery about it, which was that when I'm teaching teenagers, and if there's an instance that comes up where one of the young men is putting one of the young women in a situation where she is being cast in a traditionally demeaning female role, my automatic response is not to say, okay, well, this needs to end and we need to move on from here. It's to say, how can you as a young woman and put in this situation, how can you as a good improviser, as a strong person, know that you've been put in this position and then deal with it within the scene? And then how can we converse about it afterwards?
Yeah.
So I think that was, for me, my automatic response to like what you wrote on your blog, and I think a lot of other people too, is some of the things that you mentioned were more about how other people need to change how they allow women who are weaker to step in, like give them more space, like take more time, allow them to jump. And my perspective is that's true, but also what's true is that we as women need to know that we're not shrinking units and that we don't need to wait our turn, but we can step in and start the scene on our own, take command of the room, have a strong presence on stage, and when you're labeled something like a prostitute, turn into something that has power as opposed to weakness. So I think,
and I'm saying that has been the norm.
yeah,
That we as women have to buck up. So why can't another way be that men can be aware of what they're doing on stage as well? You know, I'm just asking for an and.
Yes.
Yes, we've been doing this as women, and I think it's time that men notice as well what some of their behavior is.
yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting at the teenage years because there's more formative potential. But yeah, Susan Messing from Annoyance Theater told me a whole list of strategies and escapes. You know, and I thought that's so interesting that women need to, practice those, because I don't think that male improvisers are practicing strategies and escapes in that same way. But I also agree that there are ways in which women self-determine their low status, that they come on. There's a quote I have from an Australian, wonderful Australian book about improv, where they were trying to do a gender focused exercise where women were gonna show their higher status, and the scene was psychiatrist's office, and the woman went up and lay on the couch. And so the guy who was supposed to enter went and lay on the floor because he didn't know how to be, even lower than what she had already self-established, right? But in the same book, they had an example of the opposite, where a woman went out and said, "Scalpel," and the man came in and said, "Thank you, nurse." So there, it can happen both ways. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was just thinking that I like that we're talking about different contexts, student contexts, younger people improvising versus people with more life experience improvising, because when I teach around this stuff, I learned pretty quickly teaching about this stuff that I heard back from a lot of students that it's very rare to have the luxury of choosing who you perform with. When you're younger, when you're beginning your improv career, when you're a student, when you're at Six Ring Circus here in town. So I found that instead of helping people figure out what they wanted in improv partners, I also had to teach them strategies for dealing with people that they're stuck on stage with. I think there definitely are ones that there are icky situations that rise from male improvisers who aren't aware of the privilege and the assumptions that they might be making. Some of those situations also come from people of all genders who are just like, you know what's fun? Racism. That's hilarious, right? Right? I mean, I think there are all different versions of these problems where we get stuck in these gross situations with an improviser who we wouldn't maybe ideally be performing with, and their privilege or their sense of humor or whatever creates these gross situations on stage. And I think you're right, it happens a lot to female improvisers because of all the different reasons why comedy is really dude heavy. Yeah.
And I teach beginning improv too, and I don't know why I don't see these prostitution scenes that you guys are talking about.
Me too. Yeah.
I never see them in my classes. My students don't do them. Maybe they can see in my eyes that they won't fucking get away with it.
I think that's the thing, right? I think
That shit ain't gonna
at
fly.
some point it's like,
Maybe I got a pheromone that says, you wanna go?
or they're like, okay, well, Jill's teaching the 7 p.m. I don't think that's a good match. I don't like Jill Bernard as a teacher. She's mean, you know. Like assholes will probably avoid you and me and Wydeven as a teacher because they know.
I feel like I don't see it with my teens either because I'm sort of like at the audition. I'm like, if you say something that you'll, I mean,
Yeah, and
you just
I'm
won't
all
be
about
around.
creating a safe space where all voices can be heard.
Right.
So, you know, I that's something that I really embrace in improv. It's like there is no good, bad, right, or wrong. It's commitment, you know, commit to your choices, and I create a space that way. I do say when those moments happen that, okay, we've seen that before, let's do something different this time. But I don't say, oh, that's not okay, you can't play with that topic, you can't play with that content. Let's see something different. And meanwhile, you know, I talk about too, like, hey, let's just notice the women in the room. Like, is anybody cringing here about what just happened? You know, like, how did that feel to play that role for you? And in hindsight, would you have played it differently? And let's talk about the power that you have in an improv scene and the choices that you have in an improv scene. So I think it's important to say it's in the room, you know, and acknowledge it, and not say, oh, it doesn't exist. Yeah, it's in the room. If
What I
there's
like to say is,
50 males and 1 woman, it's in the room. You know?
What I like to say is, okay, what you've done is when you made that scene initiation, if it was an issue scene initiation, when you made that initiation, you were proposing a game. Do you think anyone in this room thinks that's a fun game, and do you think they want to play it with you?
That's a great way to
That's
put
cool.
it.
And because of course there's no scene in the world that you cannot do. Bill Arnett has great language around it. He says certain scenes have a high tax, right? You can do any scene you want in the world, but some of them have a really high tax that you're gonna have to pay. And that's how I address it. Because I don't want people to feel bad. I just want them to know that they're probably making that choice out of fear or habit.
Totally.
Of course there's no good or bad improv scenes, but I want you to know when you're doing something out of fear or habit, and when you're doing something to be shocking because you're afraid and because that's your impression of what improv is, because this is week 2 of your improv career. I have a friend, and I'm not going to make eye contact with her because she's in this room, who told me about her beginning improv experience, that the class was filled with the male students calling the women cunts and bitches and putting them in these horrible subservient roles. And because she was a beginning improv student and she was being taught yes and, she went along with this horrible abusive behavior, that knowing she's a strong woman, if someone said that to her on the bus, she would have punched him in the face or gotten off or done something. But because it's in an improv class, she felt like she had to agree with it, and I couldn't get her to reveal the name of the teacher. So
That's
that
what I
could
was
go
gonna
talk
ask.
to
Yeah.
that teacher,
Who is that teacher?
and be
I
like,
feel like
why
it's-
did you let that happen?
Yeah.
And why did you not find a way to address it? So I guess that's why I have to say it to female students. Like, if your teacher doesn't address it and something unsafe is happening, you
And
get to
we're back
speak
to the
about
topic of speaking for people who do speak up and people who don't speak up.
it. Yeah.
And as we're dealing with beginning improv students, that is part of their journey. I mean, a lot of people get into improv because of social anxiety or shyness or introversion, and they're working on just the fact of speaking up.
Yeah.
You know? So I think that's just something that we need to be aware of as teachers, that a lot of people coming into our classes are afraid of speaking up in general.
And I think, there's a particular punishment among teens, particularly for women who are assertive, that they will not have a date to the prom. You know, that they are going to be punished in the social sphere, even if they're more successful in the improv setting. And that's still an issue. I mean, they want to say that that's gone by, but it really hasn't. So there's that, self-censorship, because you'd rather preserve your dateability and your attractiveness as a woman to all these boys that you find attractive and dynamic and so forth. So there's a real consequence to being out there.
I actually find that the bigger problem that I've noticed, at least, like, yes, in our classrooms, people aren't going to cross us, perhaps. That's the best way to say it. And maybe if you have a teacher that's really effective, they can help you address those issues. But once you leave the classroom and you're on a team, the thing that I've noticed the most is that the conversation afterwards is really difficult. Like, I've personally had experience where I've been in a guest on an all-male team, and something happened on stage that I felt really uncomfortable with. I brought it up backstage, and it was completely shut down. Not only that, but then they made me feel like I was being, like, complaining Jane for saying that I had an issue with something that happened. Not only that, but they said it was my fault that it happened. So those conversations afterwards are really challenging. When you are one of 16, how do you actually bring these things up, and how do you stand your ground? How do you know when it's time to leave? Like, how do you know when it's time to step away? And how can we as a community make it clear that those values, or what our values are around those things?
And how do you do all those things without being told you have no sense of humor?
Well,
that
and
you're,
when
censoring.
you're told that, how do you walk away from that situation?
Right.
And how do you effectively let that change the way that the community works? Because those things will still happen. But now we know that they happen. We've all recognized that it's there. Now what can we do to make it better is the problem that I'm having.
Well, I wonder if we should open up it and see if people in our studio audience have thoughts or questions or contributions to the conversation. We're not trying to solve the,
What?
any.
I thought we were. Panels are farce.
I think there are there's multiple points of view and perspectives, so we're not trying to come down on one side or another. We're just trying to gather, people's thought.
I have something that really struck me is this internalized sexism or internalized views of what would be considered polite or your role. And I've been fortunate enough to play with so many feminist men. And I step in a scene and they immediately give me power, and they immediately assume whatever gender I'm playing. It doesn't have to be a stereotype or trope of that gender. I've been very fortunate in having so many allies that are men. And I've found in my own experience that most of the times when I'm on stage and someone takes my power away or puts me into a role, it's another woman. And I've had the experience of feeling like I don't know how to address that in terms of acknowledging these inner kind of roles we feel we need to be in, or playing with women who are very gender binary. I feel like there are a lot of women who, like that term, like what you were saying, there's this identification as femprov, or this is my 5 characters I have that are women in my life that I'm told I have 5 roles I fill, and I'll play those 5 characters. And I have trouble when I myself deal with that internalized sexism of encountering that in another woman, and how to go about the relationships with each other, knowing that your ally on stage might very well be a man rather than the female across from you. Sure, I feel that so much. I guess I'll just speak from experience that, again, I think more people maybe in Minneapolis than in other improv communities have the luxury of picking who they play with, because right now we have such a high volume of people taking classes, and we have this great new theater where there's more and more people coming in. So hopefully, at least to some degree or another, people have a choice of who they play with. And if they don't have a choice of who they play with, or in the moment you're in this group that you love, except there's this weird dynamic going on, you have the option to bring in a coach, and who's hopefully smart enough or has the worldview that you're looking for, who will pick up on what's going on. That's what I always advise people to do. I know what you're talking about though, because the group that I performed in for a long time is me and 2 cisgendered men, and who are both really awesome allies, and are really just chill about that stuff. And we know each other really well, so we're able to play games with that kind of thing, because we've talked at length about how we each feel about portraying different gender characters on stage, and like, you know, we can play with each other and mess with each other and support each other at different times. I've also been in groups where everyone in the group had super awesome politics and we were super good friends, but for some reason, like, one person just had a habit of always calling me she, no matter what I had set up, no matter how long I had been on stage, stroking my beard and talking about all the children I'd fathered. And, you know, they were still just like, well, she's right. And I'd be like, what is going on? How do I hide these? Or whatever, you know? So sometimes, I mean, I've never personally had the experience of a female improviser messing with me or putting me in a position, but in other groups I've been put in weird positions on stage, and I've just talked with the person. If they're friendly, if they have the same politics as me, if they respect me as a collaborator, I've talked with them and been like, we gotta work through this. And then if it keeps happening, it's just like, well, it's time to move on. Like, you just have to have your list of like things that you're not gonna have in your improv life. And for me, one of them is someone who incessantly calls my character she no matter what I do.
It also reminds me of some research that I did on Second City, where they said for, you know, decades it was the 6 men or 5 men and 2 women, the pretty one and the funny one. And they said in photograph after photograph after photograph, you can point them out. There's the pretty one, there's the funny one, and the pretty one will be all the girlfriends, and the funny one will be all the mothers-in-law and all the, you know, but it was very obvious what their roles were meant to be and that they were cast that way. And they said, too, that later touring companies sometimes ended up with 3 and 3 rather than 2 and 4, and all of a sudden they didn't know what to do with that third woman. Like, they didn't know like what part she was going to play. And and in other reading, there is a sense that there isn't much for the woman to do. There isn't much opportunity. So if there's another woman in a troupe with you and you feel secure, she might still feel like anything you get is something I don't get. It is a zero-sum game. No, women don't get that much. So please, you know, and in Second City, for example, almost never a scene between the 2 women, you know, because what would that serve, right? Or we have a slot for a couple of minutes, throw the 2 women and make them do something to fill the 2 minutes that we need. So there's such an undercurrent of that I have just a notion that might have been where this woman was coming from, feeling threatened in terms of
there's
just
the scarcity feeling. You know, like
yes.
For speaking from at Second City, there was 2 spots
Right.
for women,
Right.
and when there's only 2 spots for women, then all the women start fighting for those 2 spots. So there's scarcity, and then it's just attacking one another. So if we can increase the pool, if we can somehow increase more women to do this art form, the scarcity factor won't be as prevalent.
And another thing that's scarce is the types of scenes that you see 2 women in.
Yeah.
I think what's great about improvising a lot with other women is you burn through those scenes first. The dynamic we see on most television shows or movies is 2 women being catty to each other. And when you see beginning improvisers, 2 women improvise with each other, they're going to do some 2 women being catty at the Gap. Now here's 2 women being catty at the bridal shop. Now here's 2 retail locations in which to be catty. There's a lot of that early work, and the more you work with other women, the more you can burn through that and realize that 2 women could be in any situation. There's no limit to the situation 2 women could be in. 2 women being catty to each other is something we're taught is interesting by the Real Housewives series, among others. We're supposed to be interested in cat fights. That's all that Us Weekly and People magazine is covered with. 2 women either pregnant or two women being shitty to each other. But the more you work with other women, the more you get the diversity and richness and lack of scarcity, the actual wealth of the relationship between any 2 given women.
Yes.
I think one of the things that I think is interesting in listening to this conversation is that as a newer improv person myself, but coming in at an older level, having done other things first, I'm in this throes of recognizing things that I really, really like, and then also recognizing when I'm in situations with people what I would call I include myself in that, is immature improvers who haven't quite burned through all those stupid scenes and habits yet. But I also relate with what you talk about, in that when I go into a scene, I don't think of myself as a gender. I pick my character, the character becomes the gender. But I find so many times where I'm pasted on top, not just with a female necessarily character, but an ageism character. Or, you know, and it's like I'm going out and I'm trying to play maybe sexy girl, which for me is fun because I don't do that normally. And it's like hard to, it's almost if there's a lack of observation in some improv partners, where they see what's on the outside rather than playing to the character that you're bringing. So they either see boobs, or they see a mother's face, or they, you know, and so you end up getting, you know, my thing is got the Midwest wit face, mom. Everyone wants to make me a mom. I'm a mom at home. I'd like to come on stage and do something else.
That's why I do improv.
Right.
I was very interested in scripted theater as a young person, and then I realized in college that I was always going to be viewed as a curvy-bodied white lady, and I realized that that didn't match how I felt inside. It didn't match how I felt as a performer, and the thing that I had really liked about theater was doing comedy sports as a high school kid, where I could play anyone or anything I wanted to. And I actually took a break recently from improv, from performing, like a few months break, and I started to get really irritable about gender politics in life. And my partner pointed out to me, he was like, I really think you need your improv where you can go up in front of a room, and for a lot of reasons all of us need that, but he was like, for you, I think you need to go in front of a room and be in control of how people perceive your gender. So I needed a weekly opportunity to be in front of a big group of people and be like, what's up? I'm a 60-year-old trucker named Estevez. What's up? You know, and be able to have that affirmation of like, yes, we believe you, and that is okay. It's okay. Gender fluidity is okay. We will see you in a way that is not essentialist. We will not limit you to our perception of women. So I was like, oh crap, I've been doing therapy improv this whole time and I never realized it.
But you need teammates who will
Exactly.
see.
Yeah.
It's a two-sided.
And that's a long journey. That's a long journey.
Oh mom, you always try to do that trucker routine. Can you get dinner now?
Oh right. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
And I have teammates now who know about my long journey towards that. So many times will, in a friendly way, screw with me. Well, I'll be like, hey everyone, I get the beans are ready. Gather around the campfire, and they'll be like, thanks, Stacy. Just as a beautiful joke. And at this point, I think it's funny.
Right.
But, you know, that happens to people, like, sincerely all the time. And to them, I say, come, jump on the train.
Right.
You can be free, too.
Well,
We will find you teammates.
Yeah. Well, it's fun because it's also how you respond to it.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, there's the yes and, but there's also stand your ground.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I had one scene where I was playing a cowboy, you know, rough and tough, you know, I am definitely deep poison. And one of my scene partners turned to me and said, well, lady, and I said, what'd you call me? And I just shot him. That's my character would have done.
With a finger gun, Cicely?
Yes. No, not actually, I had a rifle.
I do have to say though that there are ways to.
It was a little longer.
There are
than that,
definitely
but
ways to handle it. Like I don't know how many people have done Space Jam in here. I've done Space Jam like 100 times now because I always feel like I learn a lot more doing that than improvising with people who I'm really comfortable with. I purposely put myself in situations where I know I'm going to be uncomfortable because I don't know, maybe because I like self-abuse or something like that. But so I'm a little bit in the opposite sense, but it helped me I think a lot learn what to do when I'm given that situation. Like if I am a rough and tough cowboy and my name is, what did they called you lady? That's just the kind of lady you are then. I feel like there's something nice about being able to take those things and then still allow yourself to be completely selfish with your character and make it what you want it to be.
I mean,
and then later on you can have that conversation with them.
Well,
and say,
I think it was
"Hey,
fun
just so you
because
know,
it was a
that's-"
humorous thing more than
Right.
confrontational.
Yeah.
You know, it added to a weird part of the scene, because suddenly I was this rough and tough cowboy who someone mistook for a woman.
Or
So then
is a woman who behaves that way,
Right,
you know, so
right.
the,
So it was
the
fun.
gender blurring could go that way too.
Yeah, or
you
they
know,
have maybe your teammate has a really progressive view
Yeah.
of gender, which is
you
the
know,
case
I'm a
in my
woman
experience.
who's come and get it, you know,
Yeah,
or whatever.
well, yeah, I like to play with people who are comfortable
Mhm.
with a really diverse gender spectrum, so that all that stuff can happen, and everybody's got their, you know, their proverbial like knees bent, and they're ready to play with that kind of worldview.
Well, I think it's also it's important to remember where they are in their improv things, because
Yeah.
we were, you know, both of us were fairly new, so it was a funny thing because he forgot.
Right.
He
Jill,
looked at
can
me
you
and
hear
saw a
okay
woman.
when the people in the
Yeah,
audience?
I can hear. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
So, you know, I'm just saying it's an observational thing too. We be aware of what they're seeing, whether they're seeing the actor or the character.
I teach
Go ahead,
a
Jill, and
gender
then we have another
spectrum-
hand.
Oh, Jill has something to say.
Oh yeah, I teach a gender spectrum class every once in a while too, and I always start out the class the same way. Is anybody familiar with what's called a spectrogram? Has anybody heard of this? Spectrogram. I'm also a drama therapist, so I studied psychotherapy, clinical psychology, with an emphasis on trauma therapy, and we use spectrograms a lot. So people are, you know, not on the binary. So usually I'll start the class and go, okay, all the males stand on the left wall, all the females stand on the right wall. And, you know, people start figuring out, okay, where do I put myself, you know? Some people go straight to the wall, some people are kind of like, I don't know which way to put myself. And then I say, yeah, this is society. This is how our society mostly puts us into these two categories. So now let's see gender as a spectrum, and let's see, you know, 100%, you know, female, 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 and then 100% male, male, male on the other wall. And where would you put yourself along this line? And so now people are starting to see gender as a spectrum, and we have a discussion about why you put yourself on that line. And then we say, where would you put yourself as a child? Where would you put yourself on most of the characters you play in improv? Where, you know, and just opening up the discussion about gender. And then going into some scenes where we see that this idea of gender is so split second in an improv scene. Often we're taught to go right into a character immediately, you know, with a physical body, a voice, something like that. And then that's where the snap judgment comes in, where we see the binary, right? We see the male, the female, and we're not opening up our mind for the spectrum. So I think it's teaching people to start opening up their mind with the spectrum and then finding tools to communicate to their partners on how to communicate that spectrum.
Wow.
Where your character communicates from. So it's for me, it's specificity. It's giving your scene partners a name, you know, telling them what your name is, telling them if you're a Mr. or a Mrs. or maybe you're nothing, you know, maybe you're a they, maybe you're a he, you know, maybe, I don't know, but you're giving them more specificity about who you are to them and according to gender.
Cool. Would I see a hand in there?
Hi. I kind of forget where my comment came from, but it was sort of about like when you come in playing like a manlier character and someone labels you as saying like, hey lady. I also think part of it is teaching us to, as women, like if you come in and you're labeled immediately like a slutty mom, or because those are common characters.
Slutty mom.
Sure, you get to play that weak character, but finding a moment of strength in that character also, of like finding a well-rounded, like learning kind of those strategies of like, which I think both sides need to learn of like, you can play that weak character, but you also you're human, so you have moments of strength that you're not just this weak female character. You get to choose also to bring it into a stronger direction, I think, and learning how to do that I think is really important.
I often say, who told you moms are boring?
Right.
My mom has an MBA. Sandra Day O'Connor is somebody's mom. Like there's a lot of really interesting women, yeah, who are moms.
Where my question is, it's like we're taught in improv very early on to establish a relationship, right?
Yeah.
Well, in a lot of people's minds, I have never been a mother. I will probably never be, and I'll never be a grandmother. I've mostly had positions more than relationships. And men come out a lot of times in a position, like with a title, that has nothing to do with their gender. They're president of something. But women come out and they are an auxiliary I'm constantly being called grandma when I have no clue even how to cook.
Not all grandmas do
Well,
either.
and beginning improvisers are improvising from a place of fear, so of course they're gonna go, mommy.
Yeah.
Teenagers do it more than anybody I've ever seen. At like, they're improvising with, I'll have like a 17-year-old boy improvising with a 14-year-old girl, and he'll be like, Mom, you're just like, it's so sad. It makes me sad how much they're looking for safety, right? Like, I can identify with this person as a woman being my mom, and maybe then she will take care of me in
Well,
the
and
scene.
they're like, I need to establish a character who's probably not going to murder me or confront me.
Right. And there are
Statistically, probably a mom I'm safest with, as opposed
Right.
to, you know,
And especially
fellow
for teenage
assassins.
boys, they're less
But I
likely.
don't like you.
They're a lot less likely to declare a sexual relationship. So they're a lot less. They're very unlikely to declare a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. Very unlikely. More likely than that, they'll declare a married relationship, but it'll be a divorced relationship. So like, that's what I noticed the most at a younger level is like, there's a fear around committing to a sexual relationship with a woman in a scene. There's even more fear around committing to a committed relationship in a
Well,
scene.
any kind of intimacy.
Yeah,
like it
any kind
sounds
of
like,
real intimacy.
Yeah.
So for them, and for most of the guys that young men that I've worked with, like the closest person to them in their life that's female is their mom, or sometimes it'll be their sister in a scene. So
Teacher, I suppose.
yeah, although I haven't seen that as much, but mostly they go to mom, and that's something that we like. You have to actively address with teenagers, but we don't as quickly actively address it with young improvisers. But it's still there. When you're in your early 20s, or when you're just learning to improvise in your late 50s, you may still go to those safe relationships, which is your mom. Like your mom is your safe person for most people, not for everybody, obviously.
I just want to add that I started out improvising through Brave New Workshop Community Ed, and it was a 55 and older class. And right now in the class there are like 3 guys that are like Iron Range mentality, old, over 70 guys, and they are the most sexist. I mean, you are put in the most demeaning positions continually, but they are learning. Yay! So I would say there are changes, yes, and I can see it straddling, and improv is such a great communication tool.
Yes.
So, 2 thoughts. Since I'm a man. First of all, growing up, I was a part of the acting community. I really appreciated everybody's thoughts, and it really, I think a lot of it, listening to you guys, reminds me of when I was younger that I really wanted everybody's perspective. And when you talked about everybody's perspective, this thing started to happen that you didn't see people as female, male. You saw them as characters. You saw them as your fellow actor, not as male, female. You saw them for what was happening on stage, and not who they are, what sexuality they are, or what they wanted to be identified as. So that was my first thought. Second thought was, after the past year, I've been watching a lot of improv here, and what I have to say is that when the relationship happens between, especially females on stage, I was much more engaged with it. I found that I was pleasantly surprised with what was happening, and it stuck in my mind a lot better than it did all this other comedy crap that you guys are talking about. Because it really is, because the relationship is so much more interesting. It sticks with you so much more, and it's so much more life and relationship and what's funny and what's terrible and all this different stuff. And what Jill talked about, how, what was it? Something about how the relationship that happens on stage that just, I don't know, it just enhances, that nobody's gonna say, oh, you did such a great job enhancing that thing, but I've seen it this past year, time and time again. You made such a great choice there. And even though I didn't go up to that person stuck in my head over the domineering person. That person that made that choice to be, I'm gonna make this much more relationship, I'm gonna make this much more better so you can shine, that person's stuck in my head more than the domineering.
Great comment. And unfortunately, our time is up. What a great panel. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jill, for coming. Yes.
San Francisco sometime.
Yeah. I want to.
Next year
Yes.
by the bay.
Well, oh, what a great
I'm
idea.
hoping to do a women's festival sometime this year, so I'll be calling you guys.
Yay. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you,
And
Amy.
time for lunch.